But the first order of business is for me to introduce Mary Jo Nye, who will now take over our Horning, a Horning professor and very much a sponsor and creator of tonight's symposium. And I'd like to thank her for bringing together this fine assemblage of scholars who will be speaking to us tonight. So, Mary Jo.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Mayor Berg. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome you also to this evening's symposium on the sciences in Nazi Germany, and to thank my many colleagues in the history department, and to thank as well Bob Nye and Ron Dole, as well as Paul Copperman for their roles in helping organize this. This symposium this evening is sponsored through the generosity of the Thomas Hart and Mary Jones Horning Endowment in the Humanities, an endowment set up at this university by alumnus Benjamin Horning to foster a deeper appreciation of the humanities and of the relationships between the humanities and the sciences on this campus. This evening, we have 4 distinguished speakers with us. They've come to Corvallis from as far away as Germany and from as nearby as California. These are scholars who have written major studies of the history of the natural sciences and the history of the engineering sciences in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. What they will discuss tonight are the many ways in which German scientists and German engineers, like other German citizens, came to make individual decisions of resistance, resignation, accommodation, or cooperation with the Nazi political state. We may ask, did scientists behave differently than the majority of German citizens during the Nazi era? What aid did Jewish scientists receive from their non-Jewish colleagues? What responsibilities did scientists and engineers bear in the implementation of Nazi policies during the early days of the Third Reich and the later horrors of the war and the Holocaust? And what are the implications of our understanding of this period for our own time? These are some of the questions that are at issue in this symposium this evening. And we would now like to begin, and in beginning, I will turn the podium over to Ron Dole, my colleague in the History Department and in the Geosciences Department at OSU. He will introduce the speakers in turn and moderate discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. We will have 3 speakers this evening, followed by a commentator who will speak to the papers that have been presented. Each of the speakers will be talking for about 30 to 35 minutes. We will hold the questions until our commentator has finished. At the end of the presentations, we will have a short stretch break at the end of the second paper. Our first speaker this evening comes to us from the Institute of Genetics at the University of Cologne in Germany, Ute Deichmann. Genetics, and especially eugenics, were fields of research that drew worldwide attention during the 1930s and 1940s as Nazi ideology promoted racial identity and purity. Deichmann's meticulously researched book, Biologists Under Hitler, published in English translation in 1996 by the Harvard University Press, has greatly expanded our understanding of the development of biology in the Third Reich. Among her honors, Deichmann was an Edelstein Fellow at the Beckman Center for History of Chemistry in Philadelphia and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Recently, she has expanded her studies of biologists to the expulsion of Jewish chemists and the conduct of chemical and biochemical research in the Nazi regime, the topic of her presentation tonight. It is our great pleasure to welcome Ute Deichmann.
Thank you for the nice introduction. And I would also like to thank Professor Koppelmann and Mary Jo and Robert Nye for the invitation to participate in this very special symposium today. You said my talk, I start with an introduction and then will outline my, the content of my talk. For mankind in peace, for the fatherland in war, was the motto of Fritz Haber, 1918 Nobel Prize winner, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry in Berlin, and one of the most famous German chemists of the first half of this century. Haber, a Jew who converted to Protestantism in 1892, a German nationalist who was the originator and main organizer of the German gas warfare effort during the First World War, more than anybody else, represents the hopes, careers, achievements, and finally the failure of Jews in German academia and in the German fatherland. These hopes began when, under the influence of the Enlightenment and its Jewish form, the Haskalah, as well as the French Revolution and occupation of some of the Western German states, the Jewish ghettos opened and the period of emancipation began. Despite being impeded by academic anti-Semitism in the 19th as well as the 20th century, increasing number of Jewish scientists and scholars succeeded to participate in German academia. The humanities, the most respected disciplines, remained close to Jews and also women more longer than the less prestigious natural sciences. And according to David Hollinger, this held true also for the US and maybe other countries. Chemistry was a science with industrial applications and professional perspectives outside academia, particularly the dye industry in the 19th century, and it attracted a relatively large percentage of Jews in industry as well as academia. As is well known, Jews became particularly strongly represented in Germany, I think as elsewhere, among medical scientists and legal professions, in part because in these fields, careers were possible not only in universities, where academic anti-Semitism remained an impediment, but also in private practices. As I shall show later, many German Jews participated in biochemistry, which was then mainly a medical science. Jews, most of whom regarded themselves as Germans, baptized as Fritz Haber or unbaptized as Richard Willstätter or Otto Meyerhof and other Nobel Prize winners, succeeded in helping Germany become international leader in chemistry, in particular biochemistry, until the mid-1930s. This great time of cooperation of Jewish and non-Jewish scientists in Germany, difficult as it may have been at times, was abruptly ended by Hitler's regime. In my talk, I shall first present data of the dismissal and forced immigration of chemists and biochemists and show some reactions in Germany. I shall then demonstrate fates of those who did not emigrate and present cases of successful emigres. I shall end with an outlook at the relationship of German Jewish chemists in exile and their former colleagues in Germany. My first point, data of the dismissal and some reactions in Germany. Shortly after the Nazis came to power, the law for the restoration of the civil service was passed on the 7th of April in 1933. As a consequence, all Jewish and the few outspokenly liberal university teachers and also researchers from independent research institutions such as the Kaiser Wilhelm institutions, which were the predecessors of the Max Planck institutes today, were dismissed. When I say Jews, in that case, I need better say non-Aryans, and they were defined as all people who, irrespective of their religious beliefs, had at least one Jewish grandparents. Exemptions were made for Jewish frontline soldiers, such as Fritz Haber, whom I mentioned before, but these exemptions were abolished when the Nuremberg laws were passed in September 1935. In 1938, after the Anschluss of Austria, all Jews were expelled from Austrian universities. When we look at the dismissals in various sciences, we find large differences. Due to the large participation of Jewish participation, which I mentioned before, chemistry and biochemistry were affected strongly. About 26% of all university teachers and researchers were dismissed from their positions, and 20% emigrated, as opposed to 13% in biology who were dismissed in biology and 10% who emigrated. I should also add that some professors were dismissed who were not Jewish, were dismissed because they had a Jewish wife, and one was dismissed because he had a wife who was, in the terms of the day of that time, half Jewish. Various universities were affected to a different extent. And since virtually no Jewish university teachers were left in their positions, we can use the percentage of dismissals as a measure of the percentage of Jews or people with Jewish ancestry among the faculty of these various universities. And I would like to give some, I hope this works. So here I listed the universities, the German universities or technical colleges. Here is the percentage of the total dismissals based on data which were found by the sociologist Edsel Hartshorn in 1937. And these are percentages or figures and the percentages of the dismissals in chemistry, which is my own data. And we can see that there are some universities were affected strongly, such as Berlin, Frankfurt, Heidelberg, Breslau. This means that, of course, there were many people who could have been dismissed. And this was at one side can be explained by the fact that there was a rather more liberal atmosphere at these institutions, such as Heidelberg and also Freiburg, and that there were large Jewish communities at the places, as it was the case in Berlin, Frankfurt, and Breslau. On the other hand, we have places such as Rostock and Tübingen universities where virtually nobody was dismissed. And I have read a botanist, a professor of botany at Tübingen University, his name is Ernst Lehmann, who in 1935 proudly stated that Tübingen had always known how to keep away Jewish professors. And that's why, of course, nobody could have been dismissed. Let's switch it off. I stay here because I have other transparencies. It has often been asked how this purge of Jews could take place without any public outcry by their non-Jewish colleagues. Karl Freudenberg, a non-Jewish, internationally renowned organic chemist and professor at Heidelberg University, in my opinion, reveals the main reason in a letter to his British colleague, George Barger, professor of chemistry at the University of Edinburgh, who helped many refugees by giving them work in his institute. In July 1933, Freudenberg responded to Barger's criticism of the dismissals in Germany and the obedience of the German chemists and the German Chemical Association. I quote from this letter, "By this I have also to justify the little reproach." I should say the translation is by myself, so I ask for excuse for mistakes. By this I also have to justify the little reproach which you directed against the German Chemical Association. There are orders which you simply have to comply with. It is my firm conviction that a cure at the body of the German people was necessary, something which probably only very few will deny. The way how it has been carried out cannot be subject to long considerations in this country, simply because there are orders, and it does not matter at all what is the stand of an individual. I understand as well that opinions differ in foreign countries whose attitude is an observing one. It is no contradiction to a loyal attitude towards our new state in Germany when we appreciate with gratitude the helpfulness for the individual which can be found particularly in England. Freudenberg regrets that other countries focus at the problem of anti-Semitism, which, according to him, though important, was only a small part of what was happening. And I may say that with most educated Germans, the appreciation of the achievements is prevailing. We have a uniform central government of great power and an absolutely clean man at its head who is simplifying with great energy the administration. The German body had to be cured, a conception which reminds of the idea of cleansing that was so central to the Nazi thinking. There were too many Jews and too many political parties, and Hitler promised to solve both problems. And Freudenberg, like most of his colleagues, was an obedient civil servant. It should be mentioned that Freudenberg had close connections, scientific and also personal ones, with his Jewish colleagues. For example, Max Bergmann, the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Leather Research, who was expelled in summer 1933, and Hermann Mark, professor of physical chemistry at the University of Vienna, who was expelled in 1938. And in 1941, Freudenberg even wrote a favorable review of a textbook written by Hermann Mark, who had just been 3 years ago been expelled as a non-Aryan. So Freudenberg was not a simple anti-Semite, and he never became a member of the Nazi Party. But as so many of his colleagues, he was not opposed in principle to the expulsion of his Jewish colleagues, and even welcomed it as a sacrifice or remedy for Germany. The vacancies produced by the dismissals were filled within a short time, and the replacement of mostly older professors by younger ones, who in addition were often, not always, but often active National Socialists, led quite to the applause also of the students to a rejuvenation of universities. And given the background of unemployment among academics, the fact that many non-Jewish scientists benefited from the expulsion of their colleagues was one of the most important reasons for the acceptance of the Nazi policy of expulsion at universities. Richard Kuhn, since 1935, I have a picture of him. So, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Medical Research. We can see he was Nobel laureate of 1938. He had, however, to refuse the prize because the Germans forbid, the Nazis forbid Germans to accept Nobel prizes after 1935. He was one of those chemists who received a powerful position during National Socialism. Kuhn never joined the Nazi Party, but in 1936 he denounced his colleague, the biochemist Otto Meyerhof, Jewish himself, to the general administration of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society of giving laboratory space to Hermann Lehmann, a Jewish biochemist. And Lehmann had to leave the institute immediately and later emigrated to the UK, to England. Meyerhof, a Nobel Prize winner himself, and department head of the same Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, was allowed to stay on until 1938 and then was dismissed and also emigrated, and he ended in Philadelphia as a visiting professor at the medical school of the University of Pennsylvania. Richard Kuhn became the head of the German Chemical Association and also the head of the section of chemistry of the Reich Research Council, so he was a real powerful man. And in 1942, he ended a speech which he gave to the German Chemical Association by saying, and I'm just quoting part of it, he said, "The peoples of Europe are now raising their weapons for the continuation of this blood and the further development of their culture in the same way as the people of the old East Asian culture do for their own one. We think of those men in whose hands our common fate is lying, the Duce, the Tenno, and the Führer, a threefold Sieg Heil." The Tenno was the Japanese emperor. Fritz Haber was one of those scientists who suffered strongly from this lack of solidarity of his former combatants of the World War and of his colleagues at academia and also industry. As director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry and obedient civil servant, he also dismissed his Jewish workers in 1933. But then he took the unique decision to resign himself in spite of the fact that he, as a frontline soldier, was still exempt from the dismissals. His letter of resignation became famous, and it indicates the new era of a new nationalism in Germany, a nationalism based on race, and the abandonment of the principle of scientific internationalism in Germany. I quote from this letter. I just have can show it for those who understand German. Doesn't matter. It's the letter from Fritz Haber to the Minister of Education, written in April 1933. And he wrote, my decision to ask for resignation stems from the contrasting notion of the research tradition, the one in which I have lived till now, to the one which you, Minister, and your ministry represent as part of the actual great national movement. That's actually what Haber wrote. Holding a scientific post, my tradition demands from me that, when choosing my workers, I consider only their scientific performance and character without asking about his or her race. You will not expect from me, a man of 65 years of age, an alteration in this way of thinking, which has guided me during the past 39 years of my university life. You will understand that the pride with which I have served my fatherland during all my life now obliges me to demand my retirement. Embittered, Haber emigrated to England and died shortly after at a journey to Switzerland. And you have a picture. There was an obituary written by Max Bodenstein in Germany, and you see Fritz Haber still accompanied by a cross. After all, he was baptized as a Protestant. So I want to mention some exceptions among non-Jewish chemists. The international renowned chemist Max Vollmer and the Nobelist Heinrich Wieland and Adolf Winders frequently refused compromises with the Nazis and did as much as was legally possible to help colleagues or students who faced difficulties. The unique attitude of the pharmacologist Otto Kreyer has to be emphasized particularly. He was the only German scientist who I know, but I've really looked for quite a while, to refuse the offer of a full professorship from which a Jewish colleague had just been removed. And Kreyer not only refused this position, but he only wrote a letter to the Ministry of Education in which he explained the reasons of his refusal. And we can see it's not a political reason, but he says the primary reason for my reluctance is that I feel the exclusion of Jewish sciences to be an injustice, the necessity of which I cannot understand, since it has been justified by reasons that lie outside the domain of science. And as can be expected, Kreyer was immediately dismissed from his position, and I mean from the one position he had, which was a temporary one, and was not allowed to enter the university again. He emigrated first to England and later to the United States and became professor at Harvard Medical School, which was very good. So I come to my second point. What happened to Jewish chemists who remained in Germany or Austria? All of them were then without a position and suffered from an increasing anti-Semitism, which Victor Klemperer, who was professor of Romance languages at the Technical University of Dresden, has impressively described in his diaries. Klemperer was Jewish himself, and he, like others, survived the Nazi era and the war because he was married to a non-Jewish wife and thus was not deported. And Klemperer, in his diaries in 1937, just gave his opinion based on his experiences with his colleagues at the university. And I tried to translate this because I didn't have the English translation, at my hand. He said, if the situation changed one day and the fate of the defeated was in my hands, I would let free all the people and even some of those leaders who believed to do the best and did not know what they did. But I would hang all the intellectuals and the professors 1 meter above the rest. And I think this really reflects something. Here for our scientists different than the rest, and according to Victor Klemperer, the intellectuals were indeed different as the rest. Where am I? So in chemistry, I have found at least 4 academic and an unknown number of industrial chemists who were murdered by the Gestapo or deported to concentration camps and killed. And I just listed here a few names which probably nobody will know unless he is, has studied chemistry or biochemistry. This is people, Hans Liebermann, who committed suicide in September 38. Wilhelm Traube, a professor of organic chemistry who did not emigrate, and he, in 1942, was murdered by the Gestapo in Berlin at the prison, a police prison. It should be added that in 1942, the deportations of Jews from Berlin started, and one of them was Arnold Berliner. He was not a chemist, but he was the editor and founder of the then famous scientific journal Die Naturwissenschaften, and he never wanted to leave Berlin, and when he was going to be deported, he just also committed suicide, and there were others like that, which was a tragedy in its own right. We have Karl Oppenheimer, who was murdered, probably murdered even after his emigration to Holland. Peter Rona, who went to Hungary, where he stemmed from, with his wife, died also, though they were not deported, probably murdered. Maybe they committed suicide. There are no testimonies on that. Another person whom I did not list here, Josef Pollack from Vienna, was deported to Theresienstadt and was where he died after that in 1943. And I'm not going to talk now about industrial chemists. They were dismissed later, I mean, usually in 1937 or 1938. And this meant many of them did not get out, or it was too late for them to get a position elsewhere. And it can be expected that there were many more people who were deported and murdered. Let me now look at the emigres. Most of the dismissed scientists, one can really say, fortunately, they were dismissed so early, and so they emigrated. And German Jewish scientists were spread around the world. Around 40 to 50% in chemistry or biochemistry were able to find a new position. Another 25% found jobs in industry. In most cases, contacts between scientists in Germany and their Jewish colleagues in exile ceased, even in those cases where they had previously been friendly. Collaboration stopped. There were two disadvantages for Germans, and common publications became impossible, and meetings at international conferences embarrassing. The biochemist Hans Krebs, this is Hans Krebs, and here he is sitting with Otto Warburg, his teacher. He is he's the only Jewish, or rather non-Aryan. He had a Jewish father, non-Jewish mother, the only scientist who remained in Germany and who remained in his position at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Cell Physiology. And Hans Krebs was dismissed and emigrated to England. And he recalls his meetings with scientists from Germany, whom he had well known before 1933, at the International Congress of Physiological Sciences in Zurich in 1938. I quote, "Some of the German participants seemed embarrassed in the company of refugees. Others were friendly, but pretended that nothing had happened. Still others, notably Hans Weber, professor of physiology at Münster University, with deliberate ostentation associated with the refugees and wanted to be seen in their company." To come back to chemistry, the biochemistry of intermediary metabolism and polymer chemistry were fields in which Jewish chemists and biochemists were most successful in Germany, and they continued to be so after the emigration. I listed here the 25 dismissed or emigre biochemists, chemists or biochemists from German universities or research institutes, which who were scientifically most successful before or after their emigration. And even if you don't know any of those names, I just want to demonstrate first that most of those famous scientists who were dismissed or emigrated were in biochemistry, either coming from the medical sciences or coming from chemistry. And among them were Otto Meyerhof, whom I mentioned before, and Hans Boris Chain, the person who is associated with the penicillin discovery, and Erwin Chargaff, who might be known for his contributions to the nucleic acid chemistry, Hans Krebs, whom I mentioned right now. And then we have the next group, quantitative greatest group, is the physical chemists, among them Fritz Haber, Georges de Hevesy, Hermann Mark, whom I mentioned before, Otto Stern, a Nobel Prize winner who emigrated to Pittsburgh University. And then there are very few organic chemists who remained in organic chemistry and not went to biochemistry. And the interesting thing about this, many things can be said, but the interesting thing is that most of the successful biochemists went to England or to the United States, and where they became successful. And whereas no organic chemist received any position here in the United States. So all successful organic chemists went to other countries. Ernst Bergmann went to Palestine, at the time Israel, later Israel, Lembeck to Australia, and Fritz Arndt to Turkey. But they didn't receive positions here in the United States. Yeah, I now move to 1945, and to my third point, an outlook at the situation after 1945. To my knowledge, there are only a few cases in which contact of German Jewish emigre chemists and biochemists and colleagues in Germany were renewed after 1945. These early correspondences were initiated from both sides for different reasons and reveal large individual differences in the way the National Socialist past had been reflected. Some emigres, such as Hans Krebs or Otto Meyerhof, remained attached to the German culture and even people, despite having been deeply hurt by experiences in and after 1933. These emigres tried to renew former relationships by contacting colleagues who had been outspokenly non-Nazis and had refused compromises. But they had to make the experience that most of these non-Nazi colleagues regarded themselves primarily as victims of Hitler or victims of the Allies, and apart from a few exceptions, were reluctant to critically review the past 12 years. As Ruth Syme has shown with respect to Lise Meitner, she will certainly talk about that today, I think, the chemist and Nobelist of 1944, Otto Hahn, was prominent among them. And Otto Hahn. So here we are. His letters reflect his new loyalty as president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, later Max Planck Society, which he became in 1946. Here shows Otto Meyerhof, the biochemist who emigrated to Philadelphia, who had a very friendly relationship with Hahn before and after the emigration, tried to explain to him what many people outside Germany were thinking. I quote from Meyerhof's letter in November 1946. I have to say frankly that even the best and most reliable of my friends in Germany, such as you yourself, are not sufficiently liberated from the narrow view imposed on them by the Nazis to be able to identify the true roots of the situation in Germany and Europe. I fully agree with your complaints about your current situation, but I disagree completely in my interpretation. I stick to the interpretation that Germany owes everything that it experiences right now to its Führer, and that it owes its Führer entirely to itself. Germany has not only been defeated, but it has undergone a moral catastrophe without precedence in history. Hahn did not understand. Some scientists in Germany contacted their former colleagues in exile because they expected help. Examples are the Nobel Prize winners Adolf Butenandt and Richard Kuhn, whom I mentioned earlier, whose international reputation was severely damaged. Kuhn, who remained in his position as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Medical Research in Heidelberg, asked Otto Meyerhof in July 1945 whether he would be willing in principle to return to Germany. Kuhn and Meyerhof had, until Meyerhof's dismissal, cooperated closely, and they had quite a friendly relationship. And Meyerhof never got to know that Kuhn denounced his Jewish co-workers in 1936. But he knew that Kuhn had accepted to be a leader of German chemists during National Socialism. Meyerhof's facilities in Philadelphia were poor compared to his institute in Heidelberg, which was not destroyed, contrast to other institutes. But he declined Kuhn's offer. In a long draft letter of November 1945, Meyerhof made an attempt to explain Kuhn his assessment of the situation on a personal level. After calling to mind their different faiths, he continued, I quote, "This alone does not separate us, and I do not reproach anybody for making compromises in order to maintain their position. But you went far beyond this. I cannot withhold the criticism by colleagues in the Allied countries that you, by your own free will, put your admirable scientific achievement and your chemical mastery in the service of a regime, the inexpressible atrocities and meanness of which you were well aware of. I was particularly hurt because I knew the liberal atmosphere in which you grew up." Meyerhof did not mail this letter. He realized that there was a recalculation behind Kuhn's proposition to come back. He wrote to his son Gottfried, who as a major in the British Army spent some time in Germany, that Kuhn's proposition had many diplomatic sides. For example, the idea that the US would support the institute once Meyerhof would come back. And Meyerhof concluded, I quote, "For many reasons which I don't need to enumerate, I don't think even in my dreams to return to Germany. The bonds are cut." Das Tischtuch ist zerschnitten. And this held true not only of Kuhn. To conclude this part, the correspondences of scientists in Germany with their emigrated colleagues after 1945 make it clear that only very few scientists in Germany tried to understand what really happened after 1933. There was no collective attempt to understand and no public word of regret. There was no public statement in 1933 when Jews were dismissed, and there was no statement in 1945, nor, except in a few cases, where emigres asked to come back, and so very, very few came back. A statement of guilt, a regret, an acknowledgement that the dismissals were an injustice was not made at the time. The chance of a new beginning by facing the past, a prerequisite for any kind of normalization, was lost at the time. I thank you for your attention.